What if Japan never attacked Pearl Harbor? In the early hours of December 7th, 1941, history was sealed with fire and smoke as Japanese planes struck the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The attack killed more than 2,000 Americans and brought the United States into World War II. But imagine for a moment that Tokyo had chosen a different path. No aircraft carriers rising over the horizon, no bombs falling on Battleship Row. The United States, shocked and enraged, never had its day of infamy. What would have happened to the war, to the Pacific, and to the balance of world power if Japan never attacked Pearl Harbor? The idea might seem unthinkable, because Pearl Harbor is etched into memory as the inevitable spark that ignited America's entry into the war. Yet in 1941, nothing was inevitable. Japan faced a crisis born of its own imperial ambitions. It needed oil, rubber, and resources to fuel its expansion across Asia. The United States, determined to halt Japan's aggression in China, had cut off vital oil shipments. Japan's Navy calculated that if war with the United States was unavoidable, it must begin with a crippling strike. But what if Tokyo had hesitated? What if Japanese leaders decided to avoid provoking Washington, focusing instead on consolidating control over Southeast Asia and China? Without Pearl Harbor, the United States would not have had the immediate emotional shock that transformed isolation into unity. In 1941, America was still divided. President Franklin Roosevelt had pushed Lend-Lease aid to Britain and the Soviet Union, but powerful voices in Congress and across the country insisted the United States stay out of Europe's war. Anti-war groups like the America First Committee commanded large audiences. Charles Lindbergh and other prominent figures argued that the U.S. had no business spilling blood overseas. Without the burning ships of Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt would have lacked the clear justification to declare war. Germany, meanwhile, was rampaging across Europe. Hitler had launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, striking deep into the Soviet Union. By the winter, Nazi armies were at the gates of Moscow. Britain stood battered but unbroken, holding on under Winston Churchill's fiery leadership. If the U.S. remained neutral, Britain and the USSR would be forced to fight alone, facing not only German might but also Japanese expansion in Asia. The balance of power in both Europe and Asia could tilt in ways we can only imagine. Consider the Pacific. Japan's war planners wanted oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, tin and rubber in Malaya, and strategic outposts in the Philippines. Normally, the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor stood as the major obstacle, but if Japan avoided striking Pearl Harbor, could it have advanced into Southeast Asia without direct American opposition? Perhaps Washington would protest. Perhaps it would tighten embargoes. But the step from economic sanctions to open war was enormous. Without the attack, public opinion in the United States might have remained fractured, buying Japan valuable time to consolidate its empire. The absence of Pearl Harbor also changes the psychology of American involvement. The attack unified the nation overnight, silencing isolationists and fueling enlistment and production on a massive scale. Without it, Roosevelt would have had to rely on persuasion, slow escalation, and indirect measures to bring America closer to war. Military mobilization would have been slower, aircraft and tanks might have remained in factories, and the arsenal of democracy would not have reached full power in 1942. In this alternate reality, the United States is not yet the arsenal of democracy, but rather a hesitant giant, cautious about stepping fully into the global conflict. Japan, free from American retaliation, presses deeper into Asia. Germany, watching across the Atlantic, sees an America that is still divided and distracted, and the world begins to shift in ways both subtle and catastrophic. As the months of 1942 unfold in this alternate history, the absence of Pearl Harbor changes not only America's path, but the calculations of every major power. Japan, emboldened by avoiding direct confrontation with the United States, turns its attention fully toward the colonial possessions of Britain, the Netherlands, and France. These European empires, already stretched to the breaking point by the war in Europe, find themselves unable to defend their Asian territories effectively. The fall of Singapore, which in our timeline occurred in February 1942, might still happen, but with one crucial difference. American forces, normally committed to the defense of the Philippines, would be restrained. Without a Japanese strike on Pearl Harbor, Washington lacks the political unity to send its young men across the Pacific in large numbers. The Philippines, still an American possession, presents a dilemma. Would Japan risk attacking it and thus force Washington's hand? Or would Tokyo leave the islands alone, trying to avoid a war declaration from the United States? In this scenario, Japanese leaders might choose a cautious expansion, securing resource-rich areas while carefully sidestepping direct clashes with American territory. By seizing the oil of the Dutch East Indies and the rubber of Malaya, Japan could fuel its war machine for years. Such gains would give Tokyo the economic strength to sustain its empire and continue its campaigns in China. Without America as an immediate adversary, Japan's strategy of the BAS Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere could become more than propaganda. It could solidify into a reality. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Soviet Union faces the full fury of the German Wehrmacht. By late 1941 and early 1942, Moscow was under siege. In our timeline, Soviet survival depended heavily on American supplies flowing through Lend-Lease, trucks, food, aviation fuel, radios, and even locomotives. Without Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt struggles to convince Congress and the public to expand such aid. Supplies trickle in, but not at the scale required. Stalin, desperate for help, grows increasingly isolated. Could the Red Army withstand Hitler's offensive without the industrial lifeline from across the Atlantic? The outcome of the war on the Eastern Front might tilt dramatically toward Germany. Britain, too, is caught in a bind. Churchill depended on American support, both material and financial, to keep his island fortress alive. Without American entry into the war, Britain's survival becomes precarious. U-boat attacks in the Atlantic intensify, while RAF bombers pound German cities but suffer staggering losses. The hope of a US-led invasion of Europe fades with every passing month that Washington hesitates. By mid-1942, Britain faces the prospect of being bled dry, fighting alone with limited resources. The political consequences inside the United States are just as dramatic. Isolationists grow stronger, pointing to the absence of direct attacks on American soil as proof that neutrality is working. Roosevelt, ever the strategist, may still push for greater involvement, but without Pearl Harbor, he lacks the overwhelming mandate. He may win incremental steps, greater Lend-Lease aid, naval escorts for convoys, but each measure faces fierce opposition in Congress and the press. America becomes a nation half committed, not fully neutral, but not fully at war. This hesitation ripples outward. Without the shock of Pearl Harbor, ordinary Americans remain focused on domestic concerns. Factories expand slowly, workers remain tied to civilian production, and the vast mobilization that would transform the U.S. into a global superpower is delayed. Instead of being the arsenal of democracy, America drifts in uncertainty while the world burns. For Japan, this delay is priceless. Every month that the United States debates rather than fights is a month Tokyo can entrench itself across Asia. With new oil flowing from the Dutch East Indies and fortified bases across the Pacific Islands, Japan becomes a formidable empire that might never be dislodged. The war has not vanished, it has simply changed its rhythm. And as 1942 deepens, the question is no longer whether the United States will join, but whether it will act in time to prevent a world where democracy collapses under the weight of fascism and empire. By the summer of 1942, in this alternate reality, the global balance of power has shifted in ways both subtle and seismic. In Europe, Germany presses deeper into the Soviet Union. With fewer American trucks, radios, and aircraft arriving through Lend-Lease, the Red Army struggles to maintain mobility. Soviet soldiers still fight with unmatched determination, But without the steady lifeline of U.S. equipment, their campaigns become slower, bloodier, and more desperate. By the end of the year, the outcome at Stalingrad, so pivotal in our own history, might not be a Soviet victory at all. The Wehrmacht, reinforced by resources no longer threatened by an American presence, could stabilize its advance and lock the Soviet Union into a war of attrition it cannot win. Meanwhile, Japan enjoys a freer hand in Asia. With no attack on Pearl Harbor to provoke immediate war with the United States, Tokyo can act with calculated precision. The conquest of the Dutch East Indies provides oil, while Malaya and Burma yield rubber and tin. French Indochina, already under Japanese occupation, becomes a staging ground for further expansion. The question of the Philippines remains unresolved, but here too Tokyo exercises caution. To avoid awakening the American giant, Japan chooses to bypass a direct assault, surrounding the islands instead with its growing empire. In Washington, frustration builds. Roosevelt understands that every passing month strengthens the Axis. He continues to push for more aid to Britain and the Soviet Union, arguing that America cannot remain a bystander while dictators redraw the map of the world. Yet his opponents in Congress accuse him of dragging the nation into war without provocation. The America First Committee grows bolder, claiming that by staying out, the United States has preserved peace at home. They point to Europe's devastation as proof that intervention would only lead to American casualties for foreign causes. Public opinion remains fractured. Without the emotional shock of Pearl Harbor, Americans remain divided over whether the nation should risk the lives of its sons in faraway battles. Newspapers debate endlessly. Radio broadcasts feature fiery arguments between isolationists and interventionists. Factories still build tanks and planes, but in far smaller numbers than in our timeline. The industrial surge that in reality began in 1942 unfolds here at half speed, restrained by political hesitation. For Britain, this delay is deadly. Supplies arrive, but not in the overwhelming quantities needed to sustain the island under siege. German U-boats, prowling the Atlantic, sink merchant ships faster than they can be replaced. Convoys struggle across the ocean, and British rationing grows harsher. Churchill, ever defiant, appeals directly to the American people, warning that without full U.S. commitment, Britain may not endure. His speeches echo across the Atlantic, but in this timeline, they do not yet spark decisive action. In Asia, Japanese propaganda flourishes. Tokyo presents itself as the liberator of Asia from Western colonial rule, promising independence to territories long dominated by Britain, France, and the Netherlands. In reality, Japan exploits these regions ruthlessly, but the narrative gains traction. Anti-colonial movements in Southeast Asia find themselves caught between Western powers weakened by war and a Japan that claims to champion Asian unity. Without American intervention, Japan's image, however false, has more room to spread. The absence of a Pacific War also affects German strategy. In our world, Hitler declared war on the United States shortly after Pearl Harbor, a decision that sealed Germany's fate. In this alternate timeline, there is no such declaration. Hitler sees America still hesitant, still divided. He focuses instead on crushing the Soviet Union and tightening control over Europe. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich appears far more attainable. By late 1942, the world looks darker. Germany threatens to push the Soviets beyond the Volga. Britain bleeds under U-boat assault. Japan, unchallenged by the United States, consolidates its empire from Burma to the Dutch East Indies. And across the ocean, America debates endlessly, its factories humming at half speed, its soldiers still at home, and its president searching for a spark that might finally awaken the nation. As 1943 dawns in this alternate timeline, the absence of American intervention becomes increasingly critical. In our history, this was the year when U.S. industry hit its stride, churning out tanks, planes, and ships in numbers that dwarfed the Axis powers. But here, the arsenal of democracy has yet to fully awaken. Factories still produce military equipment, but political opposition and public hesitation keep output far below the historic surge. Without Pearl Harbor's shock to unite the nation, America remains a half-committed power, aiding Britain and the Soviet Union with supplies, but refusing to enter the battlefield directly. This hesitation grants Japan time to fortify its empire. From Burma to the Dutch East Indies, Japanese forces dig in, constructing bases, building airfields, and expanding naval strength. The empire now stretches across millions of square miles, and with the oil fields of Southeast Asia secured, Tokyo no longer fears immediate shortages. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, still stationed at Pearl Harbor, has not been destroyed, but it sits idle, bound by political restraints. Admirals grumble, sailors train, but orders never come. The ocean remains quiet, a silent frontier between two giants avoiding open war. For the Allies, the consequences are dire. The Soviet Union, engaged in its titanic struggle against Germany, suffers without the flood of American aid that historically arrived by convoys through Murmansk and Iran. Trucks, locomotives, radios, and food shipments are fewer, forcing the Red Army to fight with greater strain. By mid-1943, the Soviets managed to slow the German advance, but their counterattacks lack the same momentum. Stalingrad does not become the decisive turning point it was in our world. Instead, the Eastern Front grinds into a brutal stalemate, with Soviet cities still under siege and millions suffering under occupation. Britain, too, stands in greater peril. Without the United States committing vast fleets and bombers, the campaign against German U-boats struggles. The Battle of the Atlantic drags on, and British losses mount. Churchill pleads for more American involvement, warning that Britain cannot hold indefinitely. Yet in Washington, Congress remains divided. Isolationists insist that neutrality has kept America safe, while interventionists argue that delay will only make the eventual conflict more dangerous. Roosevelt pushes for more aid, but each measure is met with fierce political resistance. Meanwhile, Hitler grows more confident. Without a war against the United States, Germany's resources are focused entirely on Europe and the Soviet Union. Factories continue producing weapons at full capacity, and German scientists press forward with new technologies. Hitler dreams of victory in Russia, domination in Europe, and perhaps even a negotiated peace with Britain if the island nation becomes too exhausted to fight. The prospect of a Nazi-controlled continent becomes frighteningly realistic. Across the Pacific, Japan sharpens its propaganda. Presenting itself as the leader of a new Asia, Tokyo encourages nationalist movements across Southeast Asia to rise against colonial powers. Indian independence activists watch closely, wondering whether Japan's victories might finally break Britain's grip on the subcontinent. In China, the war drags on brutally. But without American aircraft and supplies flowing in large quantities, Chiang Kai-shek's forces remain weak. The Chinese people endure, but victory feels ever more distant. Inside the United States, the debate grows louder. Newspapers publish stories of atrocities in Europe and Asia. Reports of concentration camps leak out, though many Americans struggle to believe them. Radio commentators argue that the world cannot be left to dictators, while others insist America should focus only on defending its own shores. The nation feels restless, trapped between its ideals and its fears. By late 1943, the world stands at a crossroads. Germany has not been stopped. Japan's empire is secure. Britain and the Soviet Union fight on, but both are exhausted. And America, powerful, wealthy, untouched by bombs, still watches from the sidelines. The question is no longer if the United States will join the war, but whether it will be too late when it finally does. As the war stretches into 1944, the cracks in the Allied front grow more severe. In our timeline, this was the year when the United States, fully mobilized, launched vast offensives in both Europe and the Pacific. But here, America has yet to commit its armies. Factories still hum, workers still assemble tanks and planes, but the scale remains limited, restrained by politics. The nation is armed but waiting, a colossus that refuses to take a single decisive step. In Europe, Germany pushes to exploit the stalemate on the Eastern Front. The Soviets, though still resisting fiercely, bleed from every battle. Their counteroffensives lack the crushing weight of American-supplied trucks, aircraft, and food. By mid-1944, the Red Army is holding, but barely. German armies entrench themselves deeper in Ukraine and the Caucasus, threatening to cut off vital Soviet oil fields. Stalin grows increasingly desperate, demanding aid, but Washington offers only words and limited material. The survival of the Soviet Union hangs by a thread. Britain, meanwhile, faces exhaustion. Rationing has become severe, the population weary after 5 long years of war. Without the promise of American troops crossing the Atlantic, morale falters. Churchill remains defiant, but even he recognizes the limits of endurance. Plans for a cross-channel invasion, which in our world became D-Day, remain fantasies without American soldiers and equipment. The British Army, battered in North Africa and Italy, lacks the strength to liberate Europe on its own. For the people of occupied France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, liberation feels impossibly far away. Japan, on the other hand, enjoys its strongest position yet. Its empire now spans Southeast Asia, fortified and rich with resources. Oil flows from the Dutch East Indies, feeding its navy. Rice and rubber pour into Japanese-controlled ports. Propaganda spreads the image of a liberated Asia under Japanese leadership, even as occupation brings suffering and exploitation. With no American carriers striking back, no Marines storming Pacific beaches, Japan consolidates its rule. Its leaders quietly prepare for the possibility of war with the United States someday. But for now, the absence of conflict across the Pacific is its greatest weapon. Inside America, frustration simmers. Reports from Europe and Asia filter through newspapers and radios. Americans hear of German advances, British struggles, and Japanese domination. Some begin to question whether neutrality has truly kept the nation safe. Yet others argue that the United States is thriving while Europe burns. The economy grows, jobs are plentiful, and no American lives are lost in foreign trenches. The political divide widens. Roosevelt, still determined to prepare the nation, pushes for larger military budgets and stronger commitments, but opposition in Congress remains fierce. Every step toward intervention is contested, slowed, delayed. The world's dictators sense opportunity. Hitler believes that if he can break the Soviet Union, the war in Europe will end on his terms. With Stalin crushed, Britain isolated, and America neutral, the Nazi vision of a continent under German rule comes within reach. In Tokyo, the military elite envisioned decades of dominance in Asia, with their empire stretching from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. They know that the United States looms as a potential rival, but each month of delay strengthens their position. By late 1944, the war has taken on an unfamiliar shape. There is no Normandy invasion, no island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. Instead, there is stalemate and suffering. Europe is locked in a deadly grind between German and Soviet armies. Britain fights on, but without hope of victory. Asia lies under Japanese control, with resistance movements scattered and weak. And across the ocean, America waits, divided, uncertain whether to remain neutral forever or finally embrace its destiny. The question that now looms is chilling. If the United States delays too long, will there even be a world left for it to save? By 1945, the alternate world shaped by Japan's restraint looks profoundly different. The war has dragged on for nearly 6 years, yet its course has been altered by the absence of one explosive morning in Hawaii. Without Pearl Harbor, the United States never fully committed its vast might to the struggle. The consequences reverberate across every front. In Europe, the Soviet Union clings to survival, but at a terrible cost. The Red Army, starved of American trucks, fuel, and food, cannot launch the sweeping offensives that in our history drove the Germans back toward Berlin. Instead, the Eastern Front becomes a grinding war of attrition. Cities remain under siege, villages burn, and millions suffer in occupied territories. By late 1945, Stalin's regime has not collapsed, but victory is nowhere in sight. The war may drag on for years, or end in a fragile, bloody stalemate that divides Europe in ways far darker than the Cold War we remember. For Britain, the struggle has become nearly unbearable. Isolated, its economy stretched to the breaking point, the island relies on dwindling supplies and a weary population. The prospect of liberating Europe grows more remote with each passing month. Churchill's defiance keeps the fight alive, but without the United States storming the beaches of France, liberation never comes. Across the Channel, Nazi flags still fly over Paris and Brussels, symbols of a continent that remains chained. Japan, meanwhile, sits atop a vast empire. The oil of the Dutch East Indies fuels its navy. The rice of Burma and Malaya sustains its armies. From Indochina to the Philippines, Japanese forces dig in, constructing fortresses and airfields that would make any future invasion nearly impossible. Resistance movements struggle bravely, but without American support, they are small fires against a vast storm. Tokyo tightens its grip, promising Asian unity under its rule, even as it drains the region of resources and crushes dissent with ruthless efficiency. And the United States? It has remained a hesitant giant. Roosevelt continues to warn of the dangers of fascism and empire, but the political will never materializes for a full declaration of war. By 1945, America is wealthy, safe, and distant from the horrors overseas. Its factories produce weapons in limited numbers. Its soldiers train but never cross the ocean. The arsenal of democracy is only half forged, its potential never unleashed. This alternate 1945 is a world where tyranny stands stronger, democracy weaker, and the future uncertain. Without America's decisive entry, the war has no clear end. Perhaps Germany and the Soviet Union grind each other into exhaustion, leaving Europe shattered. Perhaps Britain is forced into a bitter peace, conceding the continent to Nazi domination. Perhaps Japan rules Asia for decades, unchallenged by a distracted and divided America. The long-term consequences are staggering. Without American intervention, the post-war world we know, defined by U.S. leadership, the Marshall Plan, NATO, and the United Nations, never emerges. Instead, the globe becomes a patchwork of exhausted empires, authoritarian regimes, and fragile democracies struggling to survive. The United States remains powerful, but isolated, a nation that chose safety over sacrifice. And in doing so, it allowed others to shape the century. History often turns on single moments. Pearl Harbor was one of them. The bombs that fell on December 7, 1941, awakened a nation and set it on a course to become the defining power of the 20th century. Without that attack, America hesitated, and the world slipped toward a darker, more uncertain path. It is a reminder that even the decisions not made, the battles never fought, can alter the fate of humanity.